Welcome to the Project Management PrepCast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management PrepCast, where we improve your life by helping you get your PMP certification. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and the topic of this lesson is the project life cycle and project phases. We discuss how life cycles are a series of phases and how your project will progress based on these phases. We also discuss how phases are broken down, scheduled and managed. We cover the characteristics of the project life cycle, looking at things like cost and staffing, variables over time for the project, the different phases and phase-to-phase relationships, and introduce you to a few different types of life cycle models. While all projects vary in terms of size and complexity, every project typically follows a generic project life cycle. And here's what this generic life cycle looks like. First, you have to start your project. Then you will most likely be organizing and planning your work. This is followed by actually carrying out the work, and at the end, you're going to close the project. So you can really say every project starts, gets organized and planned, carries out the work, and then closes the project at the end. And when you look at the PMBOK guide, you think, well, this looks almost like the process group. Well, this is not to be confused with the process groups, because the processes in a process group, they consist of activities that may be performed within each phase of a project, as well as the project as a whole. Also, the project life cycle is independent from the life cycle of the product that is produced by your project. The project can and should, however, take the current life cycle phase of the product into consideration. You may be wondering about the big things that may change in each part of the project life cycle. Here's once again this generic project life cycle with these 4 generic phases: starting, organizing, carrying out the work, and closing the project. And the one thing that varies based on where you are in the project life cycle is the project's cost and staffing levels. Cost and staffing levels, they're usually low at the beginning of the project, since you are only starting the project. Then later on, these levels, they will peak as the work is being performed. And then these levels, these cost and staffing levels, will go down again when you are closing the project. This staffing curve is different, obviously, in projects that require a significant investment in resources at the very beginning of the project. Since we just discussed that cost and staffing levels vary over the project life cycle, you may be asking yourself, well, is there anything else that varies over the life of a project? Well, there is, yes. Risk and cost and how they relate to each other are 2 variables that change during the project life cycle. As you can see in this graphic here, risk and uncertainty, they are at their highest level early on in the project, and then they slowly drop during the course of the project as more details are known, as decisions are made, as deliverables are produced. As you get closer to the end of your project, there's simply less left over that could go wrong on the project. On the other side, the cost of making changes to a project is at its lowest level early on in the project, and then keeps rising during the duration of the project. If you think about it, this makes complete sense. During the start of the project manager has an unparalleled opportunity to make the appropriate changes to the project plan and project deliverables that the project is planned to produce. However, the cost of correcting errors, of making changes, or going into a new direction keeps skyrocketing as you go further and further along the project's timeline. Alright, now that we have talked about a few variables and changes in the life of the project, let's dive deeper into what a project life cycle actually is. So, the project life cycle is a series of phases that a project passes through from its initiation to its closure. The phases, they are usually sequential, with the names and numbering of each phase determined based on the needs of the organization and the project. Things like phase 1 or phase 2 and phase 3 of your project. Each phase can then be broken down into functional or partial objectives. These can be deliverables, milestones, or even based on finances. While these phases, in which we have just broken it down, will have a specific start and end point, the deliverables will vary from project to project. This project life cycle provides a basic framework for managing your project, even with the work or deliverables being different for each one. A project can be driven by a range of approaches, everything from a predictive or plan-driven approach to one driven by change. We talk about the differences between these predictive and adaptive life cycles just in a bit later on in this lesson. Very well then, projects follow a generic life cycle which is divided into a number of phases. But what are phases, you ask? Well, as a generic definition, a project phase is a collection of logically related project activities that culminate in the completion of one or more deliverables at their end. Phases are used when the work is unique to a portion of the project and when it is linked to a specific and major deliverable. Phases are typically completed sequentially, but there are some situations in which your phases will overlap. This phase-to-phase structure allows projects to be segmented into logical subsets to make it easier to manage, plan, and control your project. For example, take a look at the image in this slide here. It is showing the example of a building that is under construction. And of course, constructing a building is much easier to manage if you break it down into phases, like lay the foundation and then build the framework on top of the foundation. No matter how many phases you have in your project, they all have similar characteristics, like the work has a distinct focus that is different from any other phase. Laying the foundation has a clearly different focus than setting up the framework. This involves different skills, different workers, or could even involve different location. Because each phase is unique, each one will require unique controls or processes to complete deliverables. And at the end of each phase, a transfer or hand-off of the produced deliverable occurs. This is the phase end. It's a natural point where you can reassess the activities and decide whether to continue the project or terminate the project at the end of the current phase. And this is often referred to as a stage gate, milestone, or a phase review. There are two types of phase-to-phase relationships that I've already hinted at. The first one is the sequential relationship. Everyone gets this one. This is quite simple. This is normal. This is when a phase starts only when the previous phase is complete. This is a step-by-step method of handling the phases in your project. When you finish one step, you start the other step. This may help reduce uncertainty, but it is sometimes difficult to compress the schedule and speed things along. On the other hand, you have the overlapping relationship. This is when a phase starts prior to completion of the previous one. This is sometimes also referred to as fast tracking, which is a method of schedule compression. Overlapping phases do have their downsides, though. It may require more resources to do work in parallel, risk is increased, and there is a chance of rework if work is done before accurate information is provided from the previous phase. Let's look at an example of each of these relationships in the next couple of slides here. Here is an example of a 3-phase project using sequential relationships. And it's obvious and quite easy to see that this here is phase 1, this here is phase 2, and yes, you guessed it, the third box there, that would be phase 3. Each step is done right after the other. There is no overlap. As you can see, there is very little wiggle room in the schedule, and it would be very difficult to compress this schedule to save time. If you want to save time, you need to overlap these phases, and this here then is an example of overlapping phase relationships. Do you notice the big difference that we have between this one and the previous slide? Well, here is where one phase ends, and in a sequential relationship this is where the next phase starts. But if you notice, the second phase is kind of behind the first phase. It actually starts slightly earlier right there. Here is where the next phase begins. See how one is started before the other one actually finishes? This can help speed up your schedule. But if you are starting the initiating or planning process before closing out the previous process, you of course will run a lot more risk. Still, this phase relationship is useful if you really need to cut your schedule time. So by now we have discussed the generic project life cycle, what phases are, and the different types of phase-to-phase relationships. But did you know that there are different project life cycles as well? Yes, there is more than just a generic life cycle. We talked about starting the project, organizing and planning, carrying out the work, and then closing the project. That's not all there is to project life cycles, because the life cycle that you choose for your project often depends on the needs of the project or the needs of your organization. For example, let's say that you are a project manager for NASA and you are leading a mission to send a rover to Mars. Well, the project life cycle that you will be using is going to be completely different than that of a project manager who's just managing a small software development project in the financial sector. The Mars project needs a lot of time spent in planning to make sure everything is solid before work is started. The software development plan doesn't often have the luxury of time. In today's fast-paced world where requirements or demands can change quickly, many software projects would not be able to keep up if they used a slower Mars-style project life cycle. So let's dive a little deeper into these different life cycle models. We begin with the predictive life cycles because this is sort of the standard model in project management, and here's an example of this where the project scope, and that means time and cost required to deliver that scope, are determined as early as possible in the project life cycle. As you can see, projects with a predictive life cycle, they go through a series of sequential or overlapping phases, with each phase generally focusing on a subset of project activities and project management processes. The work performed is different in each phase, so the project team and makeup and skills, these may vary from phase to phase. Predictive life cycles are preferred when the product to be delivered is well understood, or when the product has to be delivered in full to have value to the stakeholder. This life cycle is sometimes also referred to as the waterfall life cycle, because as you can see in this picture here, it kind of looks like a little waterfall, a sequence of waterfalls, and it goes further down and further down and further down and further down. Then we have the iterative or incremental life cycles. In an iterative or incremental life cycle, phases intentionally repeat one or more project activities as the team's understanding of what needs to be done increases. These repeated cycles, they incrementally add functionality to the product. At the end of each iteration, a deliverable is always created, and each successive iteration will then either enhance this deliverable or create an entirely new one. While there is a high-level vision for the project, which is created at the beginning of the project cycle, the scope is elaborated as each phase iteration passes. This helps to manage changing objectives and changing scope. Change is always certain in a project, and this way here, this iterative and incremental approach, helps you manage these changes, which in turn helps to reduce your project's complexity and risk. Iterative and incremental life cycles, they're often chosen by organizations who know that they need to manage a changing scope or changing objectives. Extreme programming is an example of an iterative life cycle based approach. Next, we have the adaptive life cycle models. They're often referred to as agile models as well. They are change-driven, which means that it is intended to facilitate change, and they require a very high degree of ongoing stakeholder involvement. You as the project manager and your project team, you're in constant contact with your stakeholders. So the stakeholders, they really need to be involved in a project that uses an adaptive life cycle. Adaptive life cycles, they are also iterative and incremental, but they differ in that the iterations we use here, they are very rapid. We're talking about 2 to 4 week iterations, at the end of which a product or a part of a product is produced and then released to the customer. And they're also fixed in terms of time and resources, because if you say we have a 2-week iteration, that's it. At the end of this 2-week iteration, you're going to produce something, you're going to be delivering it, and your resources, your project team will not change during that time ever. The scope on a project using an adaptive life cycle is decomposed into a product backlog. At the beginning of each iteration, the project team will look at the product backlog, determine the highest priority items, and begin work on those products. When the iteration ends, the customer will have that portion of the product ready for review. Let's review. We discussed project life cycles, explaining that they are a series of phases that a project passes through from its initiation to its closure, and introduced you to the generic life cycle of starting the project, organizing and planning, carrying out the work, and then closing the project at the end of the life cycle. We talked about phases, describing them as a collection of logically related project activities that culminate in the completion of one or more deliverables. There are 2 main types of phase-to-phase relationships, which are sequential and overlapping. As you recall, a sequential phase starts when the previous phase begins, but overlapping phases, they start before the previous phase is over. The difference is in how they flow from one phase to the other. We also talked about the different life cycle models. The life cycle for one project is not going to be the same as for another. Each project has a unique goal. A mission to Mars would have a completely different life cycle than a fast-paced, rapid software development project. The 4 life cycle models we talked about were predictive, iterative, incremental, and adaptive. And with that, we have come to the end of this lesson. So it's time for Justine to say,
Have a lovely day.
and it's until next time from me.